There's already 3 of us in here. Oh, some people's joined without audio. No, it says it's recording. Let's try it again because
I just muted my microphone. Otherwise, I've got audio.
Hi, same here.
Speaker view, let's speaker view. Let me get them again. 27. Get a watch.
I said, good luck. You don't need it.
Okay, we'll wait one more minute, you guys. So it looks like you're coming in muted, but I think you could probably click on your mic to say something is my assumption. This is all new to me, but that's what I think. Yep, okay, I think, okay, good.
That is correct.
Awesome, thank you, Christy. And I also asked that, somebody asked me to record this, so it is being recorded because some people wanted to be here but couldn't be here. So I still got 9:29 going. We'll wait another minute. Okay, I got 9:30, so we're gonna get going. Now, we left off, as I said yesterday, we left off page 1, Form 21 at line 10. We completed line 10, but I wanna go back just for a minute with regards to included items in paragraph 5. And we talked about that is where a lot of us end up writing checks because we accidentally sell our seller's refrigerator or something. I've done it, and I know other people on here have done it. But here's a issue that comes up frequently, and it is what constitutes a fixture versus personal property. And I've heard every opinion possible, and a lot of brokers will say, well, if it's attached, then that makes it part of the house. Well, a lot of you know I'm from Southern California. We attach everything. Literally, our China hutch, I mean, we moved up here and we strapped everything to the walls because that's what we're accustomed to from our earthquakes. So that in and of itself does not make something a fixture that stays with the house. And the truth is that it's not clearly defined. This is from the legal hotline, and I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I want to make a point. It talks about a personal property can go with the seller, a fixture cannot. A fixture would need to be named specifically in the purchase agreement, but it goes on to say, however, there is no clear-cut answer as to what constitutes a fixture versus personal property. So those that have taken my class before, you're used to me saying, if you want it, write it. So our goal when we are drafting a purchase agreement is to eliminate confusion. And so if you're scratching your head about a water softener, which we had that issue about a month ago, write it in, because there's a lot less confusion when you write something in like a water softener versus, well, I just assumed it was a fixture because it was attached. And now the seller's taking it, like what happened in our case, because it was like $9,000. So don't just rely on what you think you know and not write it in. Write it in, please, so that we're not fighting about it as we approach our close or after close. Okay, so I wanted to touch on that. The other thing I want to touch on before we pick up on Form 21, did y'all hear about the new form that came out yesterday? Form 22 FM, and literally, pardon my French, but the FM is force majeure. So it's a one-page form, and what it, thank you. Oh yeah, Christy, you would know. It's pretty straightforward, you guys, and it was born out of what we're going through right now with the coronavirus. And it talks about extending time periods if something can't be completed or accomplished because of this force majeure, which is like translated like an outstanding or overwhelming occurrence. Like this virus, we have little to no control over, and undoubtedly we're going to experience delays or issues in trying to accomplish our time periods and even accomplishing a closing date. So the state recommends that if you're under contract now, to consider initiating the 22 FM and moving forward, at least in the time being, to consider using the 22 FM when you're drafting new agreements. So 22 FM force majeure. Okay, are we good? I'm seeing lights and everything flicker, so okay. Was there a chat box here? You want me to, should I be able to see what, let's mute their mic, we will get better reception. Okay, yes, guys, mute your mics. So mute your mics because it seems like we'll get better reception and everything if we're muted, which also reminds me, make sure the kids are off their devices and computer games and stuff like that, honey. Make sure they're not on devices sucking up our bandwidth, okay? Okay, Form 21, page 1. We left off, let's go to line 11, closing date. And as I always ask in my class, how many of you attend your closings? And I don't see any of you, so you pretend you're raising your hand if you go to your closings. And then I ask, well, how many of you attend your signings? And then I usually get the, oh, what? Wait, what? So that leads me to ask you, what's the difference between a closing and a signing? Because we're telling our clients, hey, we have our closing appointment tomorrow at 3. We're closing tomorrow at 3, etc. And what you really mean is you are, you have a signing appointment. And so what the heck is closing? Since we're using it all the time. And closing is defined in paragraph F as in Frank in Form 21. And it's on line 73. And it says closing means the date on which all documents are recorded and the sale proceeds are available to seller. So the document, you have to have 2 things to accomplish closing, recording and funds are available to seller. If you don't have both, you don't have closing. And so then how are we attending our closings? Because this is closing. So you're attending your signings. And so I'm asking, Kathy, could you use your mic? And so I'm asking us to use the proper terminology because we are confusing the heck out of our clients, especially our clients that are coming in from other parts of the country where when you do sign, that is also closing and they get the keys. So let's try to eliminate that confusion and refer to the signing appointment as the signing appointment, because you're going to get clients after signing, give me the keys. Well, we haven't closed. Well, you said this was closing. Well, see what I mean? So just eliminate confusion, use the proper terminology. Okay, possession date, still on line 11. We see we have to check a box and it's either on closing or it's other. So, and this is so different not being in a classroom with a whiteboard, you guys. If we have other, so for possession date, we have other. So let's say that our possession date is going to be closing +2. And I'm writing on my whiteboard here, and I'll try to show you what I'm doing. So possession is closing +2. So we closed on Thursday, but possession is closing +2. So if we think about the computation of time paragraph in Form 21, I'm the buyer When can I move in? We closed on Thursday and possession is closing +2. So 2, is it, well, Monday, Tuesday? So Tuesday, because I'm not counting Saturday, Sunday, there's no holidays. Closing +2. If you have the computation of time paragraph, if you have Form 21, just take a minute at the most and look at it. And I'm going to take a minute here and pause. But look at computation of time. I really just need more coffee. And this computation of time paragraph, you guys, is one of the meatiest paragraphs in Form 21. It's one that we screw up the most, especially when we get to like the 35R. So you got to read this paragraph a lot and read it again. Okay. That was about a minute, right? So computation of time, what happens in class is a lot of people say, well, according to computation of time, because the time period is 2 days, we're not counting Saturday, Sunday, and legal holidays. So they would then go with, if we're closing on Thursday, day 1 is Friday, we don't count Saturday, Sunday, Monday's not a holiday, so possession would be Monday by 9 p.m. And that's incorrect. Because in the computation of time paragraph, possession is the only exception to that rule that you were just explaining here. And it says in computation of time, line 145, line 143, except for possession, if the last day is a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the specified time shall expire on the next day that is not Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. But it says except for possession. So possession and time periods related to possession do not fall under that computation of time definition, if you will. So it's really calendar days. So we close on Thursday and possession is closing +2, Friday, Saturday. So possession is Saturday by 9 p.m. Possession is the exception to that rule. Now let's talk about that 9 p.m. because 9 p.m. is defined in computation of time. But do you think that we would ever get a seller, let's say, who kind of doesn't like the buyer by the time they come to close, right? Maybe they feel like they were taken advantage of during the inspection period. The buyer just, was hammering them the whole time, and they don't like each other. And the house is vacant. Let's say the house is vacant. So do you think a seller would ever, in understanding that a buyer is not entitled to possession until 9 p.m., would then say, you can't have the house until 9 p.m.? A lot of you should be doing this. So if I'm working with a buyer and I want to protect my buyer, is there a way that I can change that 9 p.m.? And the answer is yes, of course, because a handwritten change will supersede pre-printed provisions. And so I could write in on line 11, I could use a Form 34, and as I explained yesterday, some of us refer to the Form 34 as the Form 34 SM, sue me, but I could use a Form 34, something to say that possession to be by 5 p.m. Of the close date or whenever that possession time period is. There's more to talk about though. In my biggest bloopers and blunders class, I have possession and I have occupancy and the difference, because this comes up about twice a year, at least that I hear about. Possession and occupancy are different. So let's say we're dealing with a home that has a tenant in there, and my buyer's buying the house, and we say possession at closing today. But the tenant has occupancy rights per the lease agreement. Buyer, are you going to be able to move in? No, because possession and occupancy are different. Buyer will have possession of the property and all the advantages and rights that that buyer and now owner has with that property, but they don't have occupancy rights. And so brokers get in trouble because they don't understand that difference, and they assume then that possession is the same as occupancy, and it's not. So if you're working with a buyer and it's it has a tenant occupying the property, you also have to address occupancy. Now, and I keep forgetting, but I always feel like Form 21 should have that on there, you know, possession date, occupancy date, because I think that would be good for us, because that would, I would hope, that would reduce the number of these errors that we are making and ultimately harming our buyer and our seller and really harming our industry. So I think that should be separated out on Form 21. But just understand, occupancy and possession are two different things. Okay, so possession date, on closing, or other. The computation of time for possession is carved out and it is counted calendar days. Line 12, you know, and if you have questions, I'm not opposed to that. So I'm sure there's a way to, like, yeah, unmute and say something, and you know, we can do that. We can do questions. Services and closing of agent for payment of utilities. Line 12. This line is also skipped fairly often. We talked about this yesterday. I'll repeat it today. The consequence if you skip a line. And so, for example, the line we're on, 12, sometimes we will see neither box checked. Just like yesterday, line 8, we sometimes see that line skipped. And the consequence of a skipped line is, as I explained, some attorneys say you don't have a valid contract, because to have a valid contract, every question that's being asked has to have an answer. Other attorneys say, with regards to line 8 on default, forfeiture of earnest money or seller's election of remedies, that if that line is skipped, it automatically defaults to seller's election of remedies, which we learned yesterday is pretty much anything the seller wants to do to you that's legal. So bad consequence to skip a line. And also remember that we are held to the standard in care of an attorney, and would a competent attorney skip a line? So you're also exposing yourself and your firm when you're skipping lines. So back to line 12, you check a box, either requested or waived. And this is in reference to the 22K, the utilities addendum. And I always ask, how many of us have closed a transaction with a blank 22K? And I'm assuming a lot of us know what the 22K is. This is something that I will typically put in Associated Docs as a listing agent. But on the 22K, which I should have here, this is the 22K, you guys. How many of you have closed with a blank 22K? And I already know the answer. A lot of you have. And so again, I ask, would a competent attorney have a blank 22K? And one of these days is going to bite you to where the closer is not going to take care of utilities because you haven't given them any information on a 22K. So we want to get a little better about that. But that's line 12. And line 13 is also a line we see skipped, and I don't know why, but we talked about the risks in skipping. So line 13, charges, assessments levied before but due after closing. you have to check a box, either assumed by buyer or prepaid in full by seller at closing. And this is one of those that can really bite you, especially listing agents, if you're not aware of what this covers, because we've seen enough examples of where there's a $5,000 outstanding balance that's due after closing to connect the sewer to the house in the valley. And the buyer broker checked the box, prepaid in full by seller at closing. And the seller is, they've already run the numbers with your help, and we didn't take into account that $5,000 or $6,000. And that's going to be a tough conversation. Agreed? So understand what that covers. I'm just thinking of issues we've had with that, and we've had plenty of issues with that. So just understand what that covers, and make sure if the buyer broker checks prepaid in full by seller, which they often do, what does that mean to your seller, and is there money there? Okay, line 14, you guys, when line 14 was born, created a lot of panic, including panic from me, because line 14, seller citizenship status, where seller is or is not a foreign purpose for purposes of U.S. income taxation. Who is ultimately responsible for taxes owed by a foreign seller? It's the buyer, which doesn't really make sense, right? How's the buyer responsible? Well, where's the seller? I don't know. They're foreign. They don't know where the seller is. So it lies, and ultimately it comes from the buyer. They're ultimately responsible for it. And the money used to pay those taxes is coming from the buyer's funds. So that's why we've seen the citizenship, hang on, you guys. Hang on. The 22E, 22 Echo, the FERPTA certification. So I'm starting to put this in my associated docs. One note on the 35E is on line 16. I want to show you something because people still, I don't know if this works or not. I'm sorry, right? This will probably get better moving forward. But on line 16, where it's asking for the tax ID, don't do it. Don't put it on there, because in very small print under that line, it says tax ID number to be provided by seller at closing. So we don't want to put the tax ID number on this form and then it's being transmitted all over the internet, right? Leave it blank. But this is something that I'm starting to put in associated docs, and we're starting to require it at our firm. And again, it just eliminates that confusion. So then when you're drafting an offer, you're the buyer broker. And what if you don't know the status of the seller? That's kind of a funny question to call the listing agent. Is your seller foreign? Now, fortunately, we've made a change, at least in our MLS here in Spokane, that's a required field now. That the listing agent would mark, so that's good. But what if I'm the buyer broker and I draft an offer and I leave 14 blank because I'm not sure, and I tell the listing agent, hey, can you just go ahead and check the box? And the seller accepts my offer, and the listing agent then checks the box, sends it back to me. Do we have mutual acceptance? Or does my buyer have to acknowledge that line 14 now has a box checked and initial, and then I have to send it back to the listing agent to achieve mutual acceptance? So that's a question. When the listing agent sent it back to me, are we mutually accepted, or do I have to get my buyer to acknowledge it and send it back to you? And the answer is, that does not constitute a counteroffer. So when the listing agent checked the box and seller acknowledged everything and sent it back to me, we have mutual acceptance. And how I know that is, and I think we talked about this yesterday, is paragraph R, as in Romeo, mentions two things that can be added and or changed that do not constitute a counteroffer. That is the seller's name and line 14, the citizenship status. So those two things don't constitute a counter, okay? But we wanna make sure some box is checked, okay? And then agency disclosure, if I'm drafting an offer, I'm gonna check my box and I'm gonna check your box too. So I'll say listing broker represents, and I'm gonna check, you know, seller. I'm not gonna leave that blank for you to do it. I'm gonna do it for you. Okay, line 16, you guys, boy, oh boy, line 16 creates a lot of confusion with licensees. And I always ask, what do we not put on line 16? And the Form 17 seller disclosures are not part of the contract. I don't want to see Form 17 on line 16, okay? It's not part of the contract. What makes, so that's Form 17. Now, back to the addenda, line 16 is where we would list the addenda that we are attaching to our offer. So, you know, 22A, 35, 22T, 22VV, etc. And in class, I always ask, how do you know if something is part of the contract or not? Because if I'm a list agent, I don't want a lot of the stuff you're sending me. I don't want the law of agency. I don't want the 41D, the inspector referral. I don't want that. That's not part of the contract. Don't send it to me. So then how do I know if something's part of the contract or not? Well, there's a super secret way to know. And if you've taken my class, you know the super secret way. And that is look at any addenda. If you have anything in front of you, and what does line 1 say? And line 1 on any addenda says, the following is part of the purchase and sales agreement dated, and then the date. That's how you know if something is part of the purchase and sales agreement, because line 1 says the following is part of the purchase and sales agreement. That line does not exist on Form 17, does not exist on 41D. So if that line is not there, it's not part of the agreement, okay? So that is what I would list on line 16 are those addenda that are part of the agreement. But line 16 alone does not necessarily make something part of the agreement, because, you know, what if I have a financing addendum, a 22A in my offer, and my buyer has initialed it, and for whatever reason, I neglected to put it on line 16, is that part of the offer? And then what if your seller initials everything, including my 22A, and sends it back, yet again, I don't have 22A on line 16, is it part of the contract? Absolutely, because buyer and seller have agreed to it. That's what makes something part of the contract. Line 16 then is just to facilitate the understanding to a third-party provider as to what is included with the contract. So it's for lenders and closers to look at that and say, okay, what's with the offer? But what makes it part of the contract is buyer and seller both acknowledge on the bottom, on the addenda itself, the bottom corner where they initial. That's what makes it part of the contract. So then you get some brokers saying, well then, do we have to put anything on line 16 if it doesn't make something part of the contract? And they'll draft an offer and they'll leave 16 blank. Well, if you remember what I talked about yesterday and today, a big part of our job is to eliminate confusion. So are you adding confusion or helping to eliminate confusion by leaving 16 blank? You are creating confusion. So best business practice is you want to use line 16 to help eliminate confusion. But then as we move forward in this contract, and for example, a 35R, the inspection response form, that's born, 10 days or so after mutual acceptance. So then do I have to go back and add 35R to line 16 and get everybody to sign it? No, you don't need to do that. In fact, don't do that. Don't do that. And I had one guy a while ago really fight this in my class, that his broker was telling him to do that. If your broker's telling you to do that, do it. You don't have to, but do it. It doesn't change anything. And then later I found on the legal hotline where it addressed this, and you don't have to do it. And I sent it to him in case he wanted to share with his broker. But you don't have to do that, guys, okay? But don't leave it blank. Don't leave it blank. That's line 16. Okay, so the signature blocks at the bottom of the page, fill them out. I know why you're not doing it, but fill them out. Name, address, contact information. I know why you're not doing it. I know, but the state says to fill it out. Closers say to fill it out. They've asked me to tell you to fill it out. Okay, I said it. Now let's talk about delivery and what constitutes delivery. So looking still at those signature blocks, see where it says selling firm document email address, selling broker email address, and then listing firm email address, listing broker email address. So you have these two emails at the bottom of page 1. If these are filled out by me, buyer broker, sending them to the listing firm email address and listing broker email address, that constitutes delivery. That constitutes delivery. Now, they added another method of delivery, either last revision or the revision before. I don't like it. I'm not telling you to rely on it, but I'm going to show it to you because I just feel that's part of the class. And that is in paragraph K. That is in paragraph K. And in paragraph K, it tells us the other method of delivery is if I send it to your email address and you respond back to me, and that response is not an auto email, but it's a real time, you actually responded, hey, thanks, Ken, I got it. That is delivery. But that's only delivery when you send that email response back to me. And so obviously think about if our whatever we're doing is time sensitive, delivery is not going to be made until you respond back to me. So why would we do that? Why would we use that method of delivery? I don't like it, but it's in there in paragraph K. And like I said, it was added within the last revision or two. But I hate it because we had an incident once where it was a buyer had to sell a house to buy this house, and it was new construction. And the builder put a 24-hour bump clause in the contract. So buyer received a bump notice. They now had 24 hours to respond. And the 22B, the response options are, I'm going to terminate the contract and be entitled to my earnest money. Or the other option is I'm going to waive the contingency and close in 30 days. So the buyer received a bump notice. The listing broker just sent it to them, just their email address. So really under paragraph K, the listing agent then calculated 24 hours from the time they sent that email, 24 hours plus 10 minutes, and then they went under contract with another buyer. The problem is that the buyer broker did not acknowledge that email delivery until the next day. And that is when the 24-hour period starts, because that is when the buyer broker acknowledged the email. So that builder sold the same house twice. That's the problem with that method of delivery. Buyer got a lawyer. I was getting very interested because, you know, I like to see how these things grow, and then we learn from them and we talk about them. And it was going to get really good. Ultimately, buyer tapped out and bought another house from the builder. But look at that. And had buyer pursued that, that would have been an interesting thing to talk about. You know, I always tell brokers, oh, and the listing agent, their designated broker was on the phone with me and did not even know about paragraph K and the necessity of the recipient, in this case buyer broker, to respond back. And that's when you start counting the 24 hours. I had to read it together with her on the phone. So that's the problem. You know, and I tell brokers, you never want to like become a case study, right? You never want to be broker A. Broker A did this. You know, you don't want to be talked about in a class like that. So don't become a case study. Okay, so that's the, that, and we have, let's see, it's 10:04. So we'll go about another 25 minutes. That's the page 1, form 21, you guys. And I'm going to try to see if there's any questions here, if I can figure this out. Folks can raise hands. Oh, okay. So if you raise a hand, I'm assuming maybe I'll see it. Okay, so then what I like to do is just kind of go through some of the general provisions through the boilerplate language on Form 21. We talked about paragraph A yesterday. We talked about earnest money yesterday. Included items, paragraph C, we talked about yesterday. Remember, when you're taking a listing, please go over paragraph C with your seller. They need to understand what stays with the house and what doesn't. And as we mentioned today, as far as fixture, personal property, write it in. So the issues that we've seen with regards to that, like central vac, how central vacuum systems have all the attachments and hoses and things like that, write that stuff in. Swimming pools with all the stuff you need with a pool, write that stuff in. Even if there's like a shed out there, write that stuff in. You're eliminating confusion. Water softener, write it in. Condition of title, they did add a new line with the July revisions, and that is the end of line 49. Seller shall not convey or reserve any oil and or mineral rights after mutual acceptance without buyer's written consent. I'm just telling you because that line was added, so now you know. Title insurance. So when we get to optional clauses, 22D, paragraph 2, we are given the choice of checking standard or extended, I think it is, sorry. Paragraph E already provides, in most cases, the appropriate title insurance. So if you're checking standard, that is less than what paragraph E gives you. If you're checking extended, that's more, and your buyer could be faced with costs. So in most cases on 22D, paragraph 2, you're not going to check a box because paragraph E in Form 21 provides the appropriate title insurance. But let me tell you about an issue we had about 6 months ago with regards to paragraph E. And paragraph E at the end of line 62 says the title insurance company shall send a copy of the preliminary commitment to seller, listing broker, buyer, and selling broker. So we had an issue where we had the buyer and they closed, and buyer starts building a shop, and buyer was approached by the architectural committee, and the shop did not comply with the CC&Rs, and it became a big issue. And our broker found out that while he received the preliminary commitment and CC&Rs, our broker did not forward that on to his buyer. And I'm looking at paragraph E, which says the title insurance company will do that. So I called all the title insurance companies and asked, hey, did you know this is in the contract and are you doing this? Half of them are, half of them are not. So the takeaway there is you do it. If they send that to you, send it to your client and have evidence that you've done that, because how would that have helped us and our buyer broker had he been able to show that he provided the buyer with that, but he didn't do it. So he does it now, but he didn't do it before. And that also reminds me to mention with regards to CC&Rs, I'm working with a buyer and buyer says, hey, can I build a shop here? What did the CC&Rs say? Can I build a shop here? What did the CC&Rs say? And what do I do as a licensee? Here they are, buyer. Read them. Let me know what you want to do, because we do not want to start interpreting CC&Rs, because our license, remember, allows us to provide real estate services and essentially fill in blanks on a contract. So something I'm going to show you, and I know some of you have seen this. Sorry, and if you guys have a question, go ahead and ask. This will just take me like 20 seconds. CPA. Okay. I always do this in my class. So we are the realtor. We're in the middle. And out here we have like a 1031 facilitator, an attorney, a CPA, a lender, a closer. You know, in what we do every day, we get all kinds of questions. People consider us the expert on everything. And we can really step into the weeds if we're not careful with what our license allows us to do and what it doesn't allow us to do. So a 1031, for example, your client asks, Ken, how long do I have to identify a property? That's a great question, buyer. I can't answer that. The state could come after me and take my license. You need to talk to a 1031 facilitator. Here's one, or here's two. When we had our distressed market, we'd get was it better to short sale or foreclose? Great question. I can't answer that. That's outside the scope of my license. You need to talk to an attorney or a CPA. So remember that, because oftentimes we are just completely stepping in the weeds because we're going outside the scope of our license. I had a broker come to me once and they said, hey, can you come into the conference room and talk to my buyers? I said, about what? And so I go in and I introduce myself. Well, it was an earnest money dispute. And so they explained the whole situation to me. And then they looked at me and said, and asked, if we go to court, what are our chances? I can't answer that. That is a legal question. That's not real estate services. That's not filling in blanks on approved forms. You guys will get this all the time. So that's where you just have to almost have the script that the state would consider that the unauthorized practice of law. They expect me to refer you to fill in the blank. Okay, don't go there. And if you ever do go there, you're going to realize it pretty quickly that you shouldn't have gone there. I mean, it's almost like getting hit in the gut, because I've done it, right? So I don't know what started me talking about that, but it always happens. So back to title insurance. Oh, it was the CC&Rs, right? Kate, can I park my boat next to my house? Yeah, you look at the CC&Rs. I'm not going to. Okay, paragraph F, closing and possession. We already defined closing, right? So we're now changing what we say. We have our signing appointment. And the other thing that I like to point out is they moved this language, they being the state, they moved this language from 22D optional clauses to paragraph F as in Frank in Form 21. So we'll start at line 75. This is where it references buyer being entitled to possession by 9 p.m. Okay. So here's the language that was moved. Seller shall maintain the property in its present condition, normal wear and tear accepted, until the buyer is provided possession. They changed the word provided. So the seller has to maintain the property in its present condition. So July, it's hot. We go under contract, and you have to have this conversation with your sellers. We go under contract. Sellers, I'm going to turn the sprinklers off. I'm not going to keep watering the grass, right? And paying for the water. And the grass dies. That's not normal wear and tear. So you have to explain this to your seller. Look, seller, you got to maintain the place in the condition that it was when buyer decided to buy. And where this really comes into play is if we have any kind of delayed possession. So I had a seller once that maintained possession, gosh, I think it was about 2 months after closing, because they wanted to finish the school year so they didn't disturb their daughter, so their daughter could finish high school, right? Totally makes sense. So you better believe I explained to my seller that when the house closes, you have to maintain the condition. You can't just, start throwing keggers and tearing the place up because you don't own it anymore. So make sure your seller understands this. And then it goes on to say, seller shall either repair or replace any system or appliance that becomes inoperative or malfunctions prior to closing with one of at least equal quality. I like this. The next sentence, line 79, buyer reserves the right to walk through the property within 5 days of closing to verify that seller has maintained the property and that the appliances work. There is your other opportunity, buyer, to do a walkthrough. So first, you want to do a walkthrough, because if you're a lazy agent and you don't do it, and there's an issue after closing that would have been discovered and remedied with a walkthrough, it's on you. It's on you. The other thing that I want to talk about in reference to this line is, and this kind of bugs me. So I get that buyers are excited. And so a buyer goes under contract. They do their inspection. So there's an opportunity for the buyer to go into the property. But then that's it, you guys. I mean, we have this to do a walkthrough. We can do a follow-up inspection, but we get these buyers, and I get it. You're excited. I want to show my parents. I want to show my kids or whatever. And you keep wanting to go back to the house. It's not your house. It's the seller's house. And so you don't have additional rights to just keep showing up to go in the house and start, visualizing where the furniture's going and measuring and, picking paint colors. Stop. I mean, you could ask the listing agent, but it's obnoxious. So simmer down on that is my opinion. And just understand it's not yet your house. And here's another thing that, oh golly, this happened last year. So, sorry. So, secondary inspection, right? Clearly you have the opportunity to do a secondary inspection if it's within the time frames. So the buyer, they were going to the house to do a secondary inspection. It was the water heater, and the water heater was in the basement. So as a seller, what are you thinking? They're going to show up, and it'll be the inspector, the broker, maybe the buyer, and they're going to go downstairs and they're going to do what they need to do with the water heater, right? The buyer broker used that as an opportunity to bring the 15 members of the family who started scurrying around the house and checking out every room, including the master bedroom, that was upstairs. And then I get a call from a very angry Mr. Seller, who then proceeded, which he didn't have to do, but he then proceeded to explain everything that was out in the open in the master bedroom, and how mad he was that the entire family walked in on all that. And I'm thinking, you could have left that part out. But the point is, right, you get the inappropriateness of that and how frustrating that would be for a seller. So don't do that, you guys. Don't do that. Sometimes you think you don't have to say things, and then things happen. It's like, oh, I guess you need to say things. So don't do that. Don't do that. It's still the seller's house. I will never get that conversation out of my head either. Okay, so back to paragraph F. Let's see. Buyer reserves the right to do a walkthrough. Okay, good. The end of line 82 to 86, the rest of that paragraph, the state is really big on if there is possession, either early or post-possession, you guys, use these forms, the 65A and B, to control that possession. Stop using the form 34, sue me form 34. Stop using that form to control and to try to define that possession period that's either early or late. Use the 65A and B. The state is very firm on that. There's language in there that we need, and there's language in there that you're not going to have when you start drafting a 34, right? And we already have a form that's pre-printed, lawyer approved for us to use in those circumstances. So use those forms. They even have language in there that if it's delayed possession, the owner now of the house, who is the buyer, that they have proper insurance in place. Because God forbid the seller who stays in the house, God forbid they burn the house down accidentally, a kitchen fire. The buyer now, the new owner, the landlord, calls the insurance company to file a claim, and they had owner-occupied insurance, not non-owner-occupied insurance. And remember, an insurance company's job is to deny claims. So the 65A and B even has language there to protect the parties. So stop doing the 34 when we have our forms. And then the other is carbon monoxide. Is it CO or is it CO2? And I hear it all. It is CO. They are CO detectors. We don't have CO2 detectors. How obnoxious would it be if we had CO2 detectors? They'd be going off all the time. They are CO detectors. Yeah. It also reminds me to remind you, make sure the seller has them in the house. Because we don't want an appraiser to go out to the house and the first thing they look for are the CO detectors, and they're not there. They turn around and walk out, and it's $100, $150 for them to come back. Whose fault is that? So make sure we are accounting for those CO detectors. And with regards to appraisers, make sure we are nice to appraisers. Because I know when they call you 8 months after closing, Ken, I'm calling about 1241 East Oak Street. Were there any seller concessions? I don't know. How am I supposed to remember that? But I don't say that. I take time and I find the information and I give the appraiser that information and make sure they don't need any other information from me. Why? Because how many times, well, okay, so when I get a call from an appraiser on a house I had in 9 Mile saying, Ken, I know you're on your way out to put CO detectors in, aren't you? Why, yes, I am. That's amazing you knew that. I totally forgot. But that was a very good courtesy call from that appraiser. Or I had a house on Madison or something down off Monroe where the appraiser was there, and the 5 steps going down to the cellar from the outside did not have a handrail, and the paint was peeling. And so the appraiser finds this thing that could be a handrail, and says, here, have your guys put this on. And when you do that and fix the paint, text me some pics, and I'll sign off on the appraisal. Be very nice to appraisers because it'll come back. And if I was a jerk, that never would have happened, right? The gal out in 9 Mile would have told me, you know, let me know when they're here, $150 for me to come back. Be nice to appraisers, okay? Just be nice. Okay, so closing and possession. Closing costs and prorations, paragraph H, as in hotel. Okay, we got about 6 minutes, you guys. I want to bring out line 106, the middle of line 106. It says, buyer shall pay for remaining fuel in the fuel tank if, prior to closing, seller obtains a written statement from the supplier as to how much is in there and what's it cost. You get that over to the closer. They add that to the closing documents and buyer pays for that. But we have plenty of listing agents who don't even know that. And so the buyer's going to get all that fuel and not pay for it. So make sure you understand that. Closing and okay. General provisions. Written acknowledgement. Computation of time. We talked about computation of time and how possession date is carved out. Oh, this is a question I like to ask in class. Exhibit A. We talked about yesterday that if we don't have an acknowledged legal description, then either side can walk, right? It's an invalid contract. It's voidable. We can walk. So I don't know if I asked this yesterday, but I'll ask it again. So knowing that, if we have mutual acceptance, I did ask this yesterday. Sorry, guys, if it's a repeat for you. If we have mutual acceptance today, but we don't have an Exhibit A, and the Exhibit A, let's say, shows up 4 days later, and knowing without an Exhibit A, either side can walk away. When does our computation of time start? Does it start when we have mutual acceptance today, or 4 days later when the legal description is born? And the answer is it starts today, and that is in line 149, the end of 149. If the parties agree upon and attach a legal description after the agreement is signed, then for the purposes of computing time, mutual acceptance is deemed to be on the date of delivery of an accepted offer rather than the date the legal description is attached. So you got to start computation of time with that mutual agreement minus the legal description. So it's 10:26, you guys. I'm going to mark off right there and pick up with paragraph M come Monday. But right now, I'll just hang out if you guys have questions or anything for me. And I think you could probably just talk or raise your hand or something. Oh, there's a chat screen. Let's see. Would you recommend using the 68A with a 65A or B, walking through at closing or prior to closing when there is a rent back? Oh, okay. Wait a second. I'm not following this. Would you recommend using a 68A with a 65A or B, walking through at closing or prior to closing when there is a rent back to agree? This is going to take me too much time because I'm going to table that. I'm not going to forget. I'm going to table it, Angie, because I got to pick this one apart a little bit, and it's a little more than on the fly, especially when the 68A, I got to bring that into my head, which it's not. So anyone else? I think you can type a question, or you could probably just unmute and speak. If there. I'm not seeing any questions, you guys. And if there's no questions, that's okay too. So I'm going to resume this on Monday. I'm going to shoot for 10 o'clock. I will put it out there again. We'll do 1 hour at a time. And then at some point, I did clock hour, a bloopers and blunders class. I'm trying to get a response from the DOL on are there any now revisions that can be made to offer clock hours this way? And they're all working from home, is what they say, but they're not getting back to me. But until then, I will break down my bloopers and blunders because it's good information and do those in like 1 hour bits like I'm doing now. So if nothing else, you guys, I think I'll wish you well, good weekend, and be safe, okay?